But what these attacks teach us, what the attacks of January in Soweto taught us, what the attacks of 2008 against foreigners taught us, is that no, colonialism and apartheid did not improve our moral content, did not denude us of the capacity to be evil, did not rob us of the capacity to be cruel to another. Now that's the bad side of the story. Do you know what the good side of the story is? What these xenophobic attacks prove is that we're human. So if anyone denied that black people are human, these xenophobic attacks prove that we're as part of the human condition as any other person on the planet. Because xenophobia is not a South African phenomenon, nor is it an African phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon. It is part of the human condition. It is evidence that we are human and therefore have the capacity for both good and evil. And therefore, to be a victim of oppression or human suffering does not make you exceptional. So in a sense, in the process of dehumanizing the foreigner from another part of Africa, in a perverse way, we humanized ourselves. We ceased to be these mythical figures devoid of evil and the capacity for cruelty in a perverse way. That's what these xenophobic attacks tell us about ourselves. You saw the adverts, which leads me to the third point. There was a lot of populism in the debate, on all sides. Africans are always kind to one another, that's what we're told. It is an African. We are the people of Ubuntu. The only thing illegal are the borders. If you are African, you are not a foreigner. And when you say that, I find that very interesting, by the way. Then I wait to see whether you understand the implications of what you're saying. Because what you're saying, I assume, is that we should enter a struggle about the removal of these borders, of these colonially imposed borders. If we don't move to that discussion, we are just being populist. We are just grandstanding, as far as I'm concerned. And there was a lot of grandstanding during this debate on all sides. Let me say something about Ubuntu, and I might offend you here. It is an illusion to think that the only people on this planet who have what you call Ubuntu are Africans. No one has a human quality. The only people who have this human quality of Ubuntu are African. Think about it, that cannot be true. If the Europeans lack it because they lost it at some point, it does not mean they have never had it. If the Americans lack it because they have lost it at some point, it does not mean they have never had this quality called Ubuntu. Now, when I read history, I find that I recognize in history what you call Ubuntu all over the world. Throughout history, there are examples of this thing you call Ubuntu in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and of course, in Africa. But the question you must ask yourself is whether it is true, whether it is still true that Africans have Ubuntu. is it still true? Or is it not true that we have lost it, like the European, like the American, and others on the planet? We too, who are African, have lost this thing called Ubuntu, and that is why you can burn a fellow human being alive. Because that fellow human being is not as human as you are. Or more importantly, is not human at all. So ask yourself this question. Are those of us who call themselves African a people who still have this thing called Ubuntu? By the way, when I say Africans, I'm not talking about the blacks. There are many white people who regard themselves as African. And if you're one of them, ask yourself the same question. Are we, Africans, still a people who have this human quality we call Ubuntu? There was no Ubuntu during the Xenophobia attacks. The fourth thing that happened is that in the debate we idealized the victim. Some said the reason why people have attacked and killed foreigners is because they are poor, they are unemployed, they are being failed by the South African state, and they are victims of inequality. To say they are xenophobic is to insult them, because people from Zimbabwe and elsewhere who are more qualified than they are, or who are better skilled, have come to their territory to compete with them, and they are out-competed. They cannot compete. They are victims, and therefore they are not xenophobic. To say they are xenophobic is to insult the poor. I heard one analyst say that. To say the poor are xenophobic is to insult them. Another false dichotomy. If you're poor, you cannot be xenophobic. So the poor are the victims. And I agree they are. They are victims of inequality. They are victims of poverty, and they are victims of unemployment. I agree. They are victims of an underperforming economy, and they are victims of an underperforming state. All those things are true. But you need to persuade me that they are not xenophobic. And of course, those who are attacked because they are Africans who are not from South Africa are themselves not capable of wrong. So you idealize that victim too. So all I need to do to beatify you and turn you into a saint is to kill you. So there was a process of beatifying the victim in this debate. The victims became saints, and as I said earlier, were cleansed of all that is evil. In other words, they became part human or half human, capable only of all that is good, but incapable of all that is evil. That is how we're talking about this. But of course, the fifth point is that I have found the way in which South Africans talk to one another about other things disturbing too, or the things they say about others disturbing too. The king is the first one. Mcebo Dlamini is the second one. And Alistair Sparks is the third one. These are examples, by the way. They are examples of these symptoms I'm talking about. We show that South Africa is ill. Let's start with the king. Okay, I'll keep the best for last. Let's start with Mr. Dlamini, the former SRC president. If anything, what the Mr. Dlamini saga told me is that South Africa is so desperate for heroes, they will find them anywhere. In the process, they will pin good arguments on bad people. Now, I'm not saying Mtebo is a bad person, he just made a mistake. Just speaking generally. There is this desperation in South Africa for heroes. Maybe our leaders have disappointed us so much that we have started this desperate search for heroes and we are beginning to look for them in the wrong places. Now, this is what I know about what he said. He said he admired Hitler because Hitler was a good leader who united Germany when Germany was recovering from the First World War and Germany was nothing. And then he said, there is a Hitler in every white person. So which means every time I see a white person, I must go, Heil Hitler. Huh? That was not the worst. Then someone challenged him on Twitter. And he said, I will kill you and your family. Huh? And you have whole organizations that have decided to stand up in his defense. In defense of what? In defense of Hitler was a good leader. In defense of there is a Hitler in every white person. In defense of I will kill you and your family. Huh? But I know where that comes from. One of the symptoms of what ails South Africa is anger. We are angry. White people are angry, black people are angry. Yeah? So, when I say I love Hitler, that's not what I'm saying. It's what that denotes, which should be important, not what it connotes. What am I saying? I want to hurt you. I know that there is someone who will be hurt by that statement. I'm doing it deliberately and gratuitously. So I'm not telling you that I love Hitler. I want to hurt you. You see? And hurting you has become an end in itself. In this country, in our discourse, which has become toxic and poisonous, hurting the other has become an end in itself. Alistair Sparks. What hurt me are people responding to Alistair Sparks who said Phil Wood was a clever man, a smart politician. People who responded by saying Alistair Sparks is senile. Now, if they're saying Alistair Sparks is senile because he said Phil Wood was a smart politician and you don't agree with that, we are offended by that. Well, how different are you from him then? Are you not offended by what he said because in your head you are better than him? But when you say he is senile, does that make you better than him? Once again, you respond that way because hurting the other has become an end in itself. We have lost the desire to persuade the other to our way of thinking and seeing. It is enough that I have hurt the other. And before I come to the king, let me come to something else I heard and was reading. There was a lot of pious indignation. There was a lot of self-righteousness in response to the xenophobic attacks. Which is fine. We should all be angry that South Africans can do that to other human beings. But what disturbed me is that it seemed to me that the pious indignation and the righteous self-righteousness was an end in itself. All people were content with is filling up their quota of self-righteousness for the day. I have 10 ticks today. I was self-righteous 10 times about these xenophobic attacks. I can sleep soundly. Self-righteousness has become an end in itself when we respond to things such as the xenophobic attacks. Our pious indignation has become an end in itself when we respond to things such as the xenophobic attacks. And maybe the last thing I must say about what I saw, what I read, and what I heard is this. There was very little appreciation for complexity in the debate about xenophobia. Very little. We wanted to reduce this phenomenon, as I said earlier, to a pet theory or pet explanation, but also to the simplest level of understanding. So there was an insufficient understanding for complexity, even amongst those who should know better. And in some ways, maybe that was the biggest problem. Our lack of appreciation for complexity. Let me give you an example. In Johannesburg, there was a march 2 Thursdays ago against this xenophobic attack. I couldn't go because I flew, as I said. So I talked to people who were there. Guess what they are saying? Yeah, I'm so happy that I was part of that march. I felt African again. I felt I was part of Africa again. The next thing they say almost made me fall off my chair. As we passed Hillbrow, as we passed Braamfontein, Yeoville, and so on, we realized there are too many of these people. There are no South Africans in this area. These from people who are marching against xenophobia. Complexity. Because I myself, I find this challenging. As much as I was angry about this attack and I'm critical of these attacks, I still find myself using the K word. I still find myself referring to foreigners as backward. Explain that. How is that possible? It's like a man who is progressive, who understands feminism and so on, but wakes up every morning to say, my wife is going to make me coffee. How do you explain that? Complexity. So if anything, as we continue with this conversation, we need to improve our capacity for appreciating complexity. Because if we do that, we are not going to be provoked to easy solutions and easy answers. The king. In Joburg, I must tell you, I would have been much harsher in my analysis of the king than I can be here. But even with the king, there is a need to appreciate complexity. Now, legally, I am Xhosa. I say legally because my identity is much more complex than this. So if you call me Xhosa, you are reducing my identity to a single point. My complexity, my identity is much more complex than that. But legally, I'm Xhosa. My mother is Zulu, which is more important. And as some of you might know, I went to school as well, 12 MLAS. Wow. So no one can accuse me of not understanding Zulu because I lived in Lamontville. Wow. So you can't accuse me of not understanding Zulu. So when the king said he was quoted out of context, he was not talking to me. Not at all. It's very clear what he said, that the foreigners must pack and go. That's very clear. Must pack and go. In any language, in any context, that is wrong. This is where the complexity comes. And I was persuaded by my driver this afternoon, because up to this point I was quite hard. My driver says, no, Mr. Matshiqi. The king was absolutely wrong in saying they make the place dirty and so on and so on. They must pack and go. But those who say his intention was for foreigners to be killed are wrong too. Yeah. And I'm persuaded. You can tell me whether I'm wrong to be persuaded. I somehow want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I believe him when he says, I don't believe, you see, we must distinguish between two things. If you say to me, it was not his intention that foreigners must be killed, I'm persuaded easily. I agree with that. I don't think it was the king's intention that foreigners should be killed. Where I part ways with the king is his failure to see the link between his words and the actions that followed. If I say, vegetarians are witches, she's a vegetarian, she's a witch, she will suck your blood, she's a snake, and then after this event, she is assaulted. Clearly there's a link between my words. I did not say assault her, but I created the climate for the assault. So the words of the king created the climate for the xenophobic attacks. That is not the same as saying it was his intention that foreigners must be killed, because today I am persuaded that it was not his intention. But he must take responsibility to the extent that there was a connection between his words and the actions that followed. Then the EFF came out defending the king. Then the ANC, they were falling all over themselves to see who would be the first to defend him, and tripping all over themselves. Say, look at me, I'm defending you, I'm defending you. And what did that tell me? We might have to accept that in this country, like in any other country, there will be times when the truth matters less than votes. Because the EFF and the ANC came to the defense of the king because in their view, or in their minds, they did not want to alienate the king, because by doing so they would be alienating his subjects, real and imaginary, and those subjects would not vote for them. And therefore, votes became more important than the truth to the EFF and the ANC on this matter. But he showed me something else. Leadership positions are not always occupied by leaders. Yes. That's what he showed me. Leadership positions are not always occupied by leaders. So was it xenophobia? People have said the dictionary meaning of xenophobia is fear of foreigners. And that's true. And they said, well, during these attacks, if I attack you, I'm not expressing a fear. I'm not showing fear. I'm showing the opposite. True. I'm sorry. You know? Yeah, as they say in the Eastern Cape, Zabu, Apabu. I won't finish that. So, if the dictionary meaning is xenophobia is the fear of foreigners, the attacks are not xenophobic. Now, here's my response. I have two responses. First of all, it is disingenuous to pretend that meanings are always reduced to what they connote. Words and phrases are always reduced to what they connote. We all know that meaning is created also by what words denote. In other words, words have meaning beyond their original meaning. And as we use them, we create new meanings. In the same way, you can't reduce the term xenophobia to the dictionary meaning. That's disingenuous. But they know that. The people who say that know this. There's something more important they're running away from. We were victims of apartheid and colonialism. We are going through a moral crisis. And in an attempt to extricate ourselves from that moral crisis, we must declare ourselves not xenophobic. And therefore, these attacks were not xenophobic. For me, that's the main reason behind this obfuscation. In fact, we have a deeper problem. Like every human being on earth, we are afflicted by several layers of prejudice. We are xenophobic, we are homophobic, we are sexist, we are racist, we are tribalist. I'm using the word tribalist, I advise it, it's better to say ethnicity. But we are afflicted by all these layers of prejudice. It is therefore true that because of their poor social conditions, people attack foreigners. But their poverty is not the underlying cause. It is their prejudice that is the underlying cause. So the underlying factor is xenophobia here. They didn't go out to attack just anyone. The target was picked carefully. They picked the target like an assassin. The target was a foreigner. He who is not from here, he who does not look like me, he who does not sound like me, he who does not dress like me, he who does not eat what I eat, was the target. So there was an element of rationality. So in this act that seemed irrational, hordes of people going out day and night to attack foreigners, in the midst of what appeared to be irrational, there was actually a rational choice of the target. Rationally, the target was not going to be a South African. And rationally, we know that most jobs are taken not by foreigners, but by South Africans. So in what looked irrational, there was the rational choice of choosing the target. In other words, the poor social and economic conditions were the trigger, not the underlying cause. They were the trigger. It's like someone who is poor and who seems humble, and then all of a sudden he's a millionaire, maybe won a big tender for watching people working. Now, and then the next thing is he's wearing Louis Vuitton 20,000 rand trouser and buys his furniture in Italy and so on. Okay? Eats sushi from your chest and all. For me, the tendency that makes him do all these things pre-exists his wealth. It was always there. The wealth brought it to the fore. In the same way, the prejudice pre-exists the attacks. The poor social and economic conditions brought the prejudice to the fore. So it is the prejudice, to me, that is the underlying factor, not the poor social and economic conditions. How am I for time? Finished. Which is good because I'm closing. So, what must we do? Let me start with what we must not do. What tends to happen is that when human suffering is removed from the front pages of newspapers, we pretend it no longer exists. This story is moving off the front pages already. But we must continue reflecting. We must continue talking. But more importantly, we must give narrative dignity to these communities we are condemning. Because we have not heard them. We have not given them narrative dignity. We don't have to like what they are saying. We don't have to agree with them. They don't have to agree with us. But we must give them narrative dignity. And narrative dignity is not about giving them space within the four walls of the discourse you have constructed. Tear down the walls of your discourse. Create a new space. A space in which you and them, everyone has narrative dignity. Because without the narrative dignity of these communities, these attacks will recur. Not because they don't have a voice, they do. We just refuse to hear. So we must talk continuously. We must not let up. Because if we do, this will happen again. And as I said in closing, if anything, the one thing you must take out of what I'm saying is a better appreciation for complexity. And more importantly, we must engage with these complex national issues with a sense of humility. Thank you.